Before we had Protestant churches, before the Vatican, before the term Catholic even held the weight it does today, Christianity was already wrestling with a fundamental question. Is God one or is God two? This core debate didn't begin in Europe. It didn't originate with white theologians, councils, or cathedrals. The roots of this split stretch back to the early interactions between African spiritual thought and Roman imperial theology, and it would shape the trajectory of Christianity forever. At the center of this theological divide is the nature of Jesus. According to the Roman perspective, which would later form the foundation of Western Christianity, God exists in dual form, divine and human. In this view, Jesus is both fully God and fully man. This duality became a central tenet of what would become Catholic doctrine, a doctrine that emphasizes separation, heaven versus earth, flesh versus spirit, man versus earth, flesh versus spirit. But Africans, particularly the early Christian communities in Egypt and Ethiopia, did not agree with this dualistic view. Their understanding of divinity was rooted in a much older and holistic tradition. For them, God is one not divided into parts, not a being split between opposites. Africans believe that divinity is unified, interconnected, and that all living things are a part of that singular divine presence. This concept was in harmony with their spiritual systems long before Christianity even arrived. This disagreement became the first major theological split in Christianity long before Martin Luther's Reformation in the 1500s, and centuries before the development of denominations like Baptists, Methodists, and Episcopalians. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church didn't formally exist at the time of this divide. What we see is an early African resistance to Roman misinterpretation of African spiritual knowledge. The Africans who held to the belief in the oneness of God began to form a church identity of their own. This group would eventually be known as the Coptic Church, a body of African Christians rooted in Egypt who preserved their spiritual understanding and teachings in the face of Roman domination. Out of the Coptic tradition grew the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, and still active today. Even the word Tewahedo in the Ethiopian church means being made one, or unity, a direct reference to their foundational belief that Jesus is one, not two separate natures. Their theology remains a living challenge to the Roman-imposed dualism that defines most Western Christianity. So, when we talk about the split in Christianity, we must understand that it was never just about power or territory. It was about spiritual worldview. The Romans took African teachings, tried to redefine them, and built a system around separation and control. But the Africans said, no, we will not follow your misinterpretation. The result? One branch becomes the Imperial Church of Rome, eventually dominating Europe and colonizing much of the world through doctrine and sword. The other becomes the spiritually resilient African church, keeping alive the ancient understanding of unity, divinity, and wholeness. And to this day, that African tradition survives, not as a footnote in Christian history, but as its foundation.
The split came where the Romans said that God has two elements, two personalities, man and God, and that Jesus symbolizes both. And the Africans say, no, God is one. He doesn't have this kind of division. It is just one thing and we're all a part of it. And that becomes the split. And those who say God is one are the people we are calling the Coptic Church. Out of that will arise what we call the Ethiopian Church. Okay. And all of this happens before there's a Catholic Church. And certainly before the 1500s, when it becomes the Protestant Church with the Reformation of Luther and the Lutheran Church, which leads to the Baptist, the Methodist, Episcopalian, and all that stuff. Those are babies trying to interpret this body of information which the whites, Romans got from the Africans and wanted to misinterpret. And the Africans saying, we're not going to go with your misinterpretation. So the African church becomes what you call the Coptic Church. And that becomes the Ethiopian Church. Till today, those views are the same.